what were your general findings about refugee issues being represented in mainstream news in New Zealand?
Because the media were fully in support of New Zealand doing something to help the Syrian refugees, there was a lot of very emotive language that was used. So people were described as, these very distressing scenes, tragic, helpless, hopeless. And they were used to make a point about New Zealand is not doing enough. What are we doing? Come on, government. You need to actually respond to this. And so there was a lot of shaming going on. And, it was the national government at the time. They had initially not refused, but they weren't going to raise the quota because there was a whole discussion about we should be raising our quota. The quota hasn't changed in 30 odd years. We're actually going backwards. And there was lots of comparisons of New Zealand with the rest of the world and, countries that had resettlement programs, and we weren't doing enough. And so, it was very emotive. It was very shaming on the government of the day, and refugees within that representation were very much described as these helpless, hopeless victims that we needed to save. That was generally how it went down. And look, compared to other media that represented refugees as a security threat, and we must stop them, we must close our borders, they're dangerous, they're potential terrorists, we don't know who they are, there's lots of men, there was some awful things in Europe about the Syrian refugees and other refugees that who kind of joined, I guess, the exodus into Europe. At least the New Zealand media didn't do that, but generally speaking, there were very few people from refugee backgrounds, like people who had resettled in New Zealand, who were interviewed for stories. There were a lot of, I guess, experts, in quoted commas, talking on behalf of refugees in general. The times where people from refugee backgrounds were interviewed, a lot of the stories very much focused on their trauma. Or the other theme, I guess, that came out was what refugees had contributed to New Zealand. So going into that second part of the question about what did that say about New Zealand, this argument for we must save them because we are good people. We are a humanitarian country. It is the Kiwi way. It's who we are as people. So it really much fed into this idea of New Zealand national identity and who we are. What is our metal of a people? Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting that you definitely saw that within this issue, there was a shaming from the media, and the media seemed to take a very clear stance and a role, which at its baseline, I am in support of. I think it's fantastic that, as you said, in comparison to medias in other parts of the world, that is not always the case. And yet, within journalism, when we think about the media, I guess I would say step one is report what is happening somewhere else in the world. And step two is this is what we think about what is happening elsewhere in the world and what should be done. And then that third step is, and will you then talk to people who are insiders within this process and it not just be to summarize really simply, we are the media, this is our opinion on what is happening overseas in the world. Yeah. And that next step is going out and speaking to people, for example, from refugee backgrounds. And so the third research question, the key findings from your interviews, the people you spoke to, the things that you think are most important to translate to us, to the audience.
Well, I think, the negative consequence, I guess, of humanitarian portrayals of refugees, that on the one hand, it's great that New Zealand wants to support refugees by and large, and people were very supportive of raising the quota. Media was not subtle in its condemnation of this seemingly inaction of the government, at the time. But because it positions refugees in this very one-dimensional, stereotypical way and often highlights the trauma, people get labelled a certain way. And I guess from those who I spoke to from refugee backgrounds, they did feel that it really hindered their ability and ability of others that they knew who'd come in on the resettlement program to resettle well in New Zealand, to feel like they belonged here, to feel that actually they are New Zealanders. Well, they themselves saw themselves as New Zealanders. Why wouldn't they? technically when a refugee comes, to New Zealand, is resettled in New Zealand, they're no longer a refugee. That's a legal, construct, right? They come in as permanent New Zealand residents and then they can apply for citizenship, after 5 years. So they very much saw themselves as New Zealanders. But, because, a lot of people who come in on the resettlement program look visibly different, like they, obviously Middle Eastern, if a woman's got a hijab, or, they come from an African country, they're very clearly not, I guess, like everyone else, so to speak, going back into those, well, what is a New Zealander, that aside. But because refugees are positioned in the media in this very one-dimensional way, they felt that when they would talk to people and if people found out that they came from a refugee background, it's almost like people saw them in a different way, didn't quite see them as being just ordinary New Zealanders. It's like there was some sort of deficiency, or they, how come you can afford a MacBook, or how come you can afford to send money overseas to your family? You're a refugee, aren't you? There was lots of stories of that not really feeling wholly accepted. And even people who'd been here for 10 or so years still encountered that every now and again, right? And so that is the implication from these representations. On the one hand, great that we're supportive, but the negative implication is it can be very negative for people who are trying to resettle here well and integrate into New Zealand society the best they can. But in saying that, people that I spoke to, were very clear about who they were and how they wanted to be seen and how they constructed their own identity. And so for some people really rejected the refugee label, because I asked people, well, what does that word even mean to you? Do you associate with it? Do you hate it? Do you not care? How do you feel about that word? And I was really surprised by the amount of people who said, no, that's part of my identity. That's part of who I am. It's part of the reason why I'm here in New Zealand. I see that word as representing, strength, survival. There's power in that word. I'm here because I survived, and I've made something of myself here. So there was a really strong sense of agency in how people chose to use or not use that word, identify or not, but also how they chose to see themselves and how they chose to ask others to see them. In various different ways. And so I guess that goes back to the idea that, yes, you can be labelled, but it doesn't mean that you're labelled forever, or that you can't transform, contest, reconstruct that representation. Yes, words are powerful and words have meaning, and the media does have power to construct, but people also have agency to contest those representations and transform them.
Thanks for watching PhD Unpacked. If you enjoyed that little snippet and you want to watch the whole interview and have access to a whole bunch of extra stuff surrounding the PhD Unpacked project, head over to Patreon and become a patron. Patreon.com/PhD Unpacked.